Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. It's Alan, the Comic Collector Geek, and this video is going to be interesting, I hope. I've been thinking about this for a while. Pretty much on a daily basis, especially when I do my Q&A videos, I get the question where people ask, are comics going to be worthless? Is the market dead? I hear it pretty much all the time because I watch too many videos about the market dying. So I hear this all the time that market is dead. Comic book collecting it's all over. All these books are going to be worthless. That's kind of this thing that you hear, like it's a it's a trope in a way. But I kind of want to go through the arguments and kind of pick them apart and look at maybe kind of steel manning their arguments of why the market is going to die. So what would make the comic book market actually die? So here are the ones that I think. Okay, so the first one is that there's no new collectors. And that's one of the arguments I hear quite often, that the market's going to die because there's no new collectors. It's just old men collecting comics, and there's no new collectors coming into the hobby. And you need new collectors to keep the hobby going, or it's going to just die, right? Because once the people who collect comics die, well, there's nobody else to collect these comics. So that's one of the arguments I've heard quite frequently, that there's just not enough new collectors, and even young collectors, they can't get into the hobby because comics are too expensive, and there's not enough material for them to even get into the hobby. So those are that's the first argument that I hear, this no new collectors idea. So when I think about this, I think about the last convention that I went to, and I was shocked. Actually, it was a comic book convention. There wasn't that much comics at the comic book convention. Actually, it was kind of a mix. There was a mixture of Funko Pops, like anime stuff, swords. There were comics there, okay? But I'd say like the comics represented maybe a tenth of all the vendors that were there. So it's like a small section. However, the demographic of the people that were attending this convention, this comic book convention, were generally under the age of 30. Majority. I'd say the median age was maybe in that early 20s, or if not younger. Okay? So it's a fairly young crowd. Okay? And I thought, okay, how are these comic book vendors doing at this thing? They're already mitigated to being a smaller portion of a comic book convention. That's one thing. But how are they actually doing? And I actually saw young people buying comics. I was actually shocked. I was going to be all old men kind of, well, let's get out the books. It's like, but there were young people buying the books. And it was, the other thing that I noticed was there was a lot of crossover where you have them buying things where they're obviously interested in the movies. They would dress up as Thor or some character from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and they would be buying comics that kind of corresponded to that. And a lot of them, you could see that they were interested, but they were needing that guidance, and they were looking to the vendors for some guidance. And I could see them really being keen, because we've been told so much that there's no young collectors getting into the hobby. Well, the vendors are keen to encourage young people into the hobby. So there was a good kind of transfer of knowledge there, which I thought was awesome. So I actually don't really feel that the new collectors trope that people keep on saying, that, oh, there's no new collectors and the hobby's going to die. I actually don't believe that's true. And the interesting thing for me is I can think of not just young collectors that are just dabbling in the hobby, but I can think of some young collectors that I know personally that are not low end collectors, but high end collectors that are buying $100,000 books. And I can think of a few that kind of fit that profile. Um, and they are serious about the hobby, and they're serious about making it not only a business, but they actually really enjoy the hobby. So I do see that there's definitely interest there, and I think there's enough crossover between other things and comics that you'll get some of that younger audience coming into comics. I've been talking about this for a while, where I was saying, like, if you look at the manga sales, you look at the Scholastic book sales, they're just massive. But a lot of those things are comics in a different form. And that same audience could easily transfer over to comics. And I think the movies, when they're popular, they can, bring over that audience, and they want to, they're interested in getting that material. It's just they have to be brought over to it. And I think the movies and good TV series have that effect where they bring them over. And I'm actually surprised, like when people say, oh, they are not willing to, a comic book at $5 or $6 or $7, whatever the comic books sell for now. Feels like they're always really expensive. It's like $6 or something crazy for a comic. They say, oh, that's pricing the kids out of the hobby. But I see comic kids buying books or getting their parents to buy the books that are $10 to $20. So I'm not really believing that. I don't really feel like that's actually true, that they're getting priced out. They're just buying other things. And as I said, there could be that crossover where they could be pulled back into the hobby or into the hobby. So this whole new collectors thing, I'm not a big advocate for it. I don't believe it's true. So that's the first steel man that I would like to put out there. And I'd like to hear people's comments below on all of these, and tell me if I'm wrong or right. I'm just putting it out there. I'm at least putting the ideas out there, and I'd like to hear feedback. The next one that I hear is that the comic book market itself, like the new comic book market, is dying. And that's maybe slightly true. I would have to say it's slightly true. You look at the print runs of modern comics, and they range from maybe 10,000 to 20, maybe 50,000 if it's a more popular title. And that's pretty low print runs. You compare that to the 90s, where you have, in the millions being printed of any particular comic title. Or in the golden age, even, there was millions of each comic being produced. So, these low print runs represent a sort of a weak market, that there's just not enough new inventory, and there's just not enough interest in that new inventories. And part of the problem is most of the stories nowadays are pretty weak. It's just there's just not that interest because there's just not interesting stuff. Again, I point to the Scholastic books kind of reversing that. I think Scholastic books represents, if you consider them comics, they represent 99% of the market. It's massive amount of sales happening. It's just not in what we collect. It's just those people need to be brought over. But the question becomes, if the comic market continues, right, where it's kind of, scaling back on their production numbers, and eventually that goes to zero, right? Well, what happens? If there's no new inventory, and that's a possibility, that you hear things where Diamond Distribution kind of went bankrupt, got kind of rescued, now it's been bought out. It seems to be solvent again. There's that kind of fear that the whole hobby could fall apart from the front end, which is that modern new comics that are being put into the hobby. So is that the case? Is that going to happen? And the thing that always amazes me is how if you produce a good comic, there there is actually a huge number of sales that happen, and it's weird how that works. I think of Berserker, and it's not a great example, but it's a good example. um, Berserker is a book where I think it had a print run of 500,000, which is a pretty big number. It might be actually more than that if you count all the variants and stuff like that. But Berserker, 500,000. Okay, that's a pretty big number. Um, and the reason it had such a big number was it was a comic book created by Keanu Reeves. He's a very popular actor, and it sounded like a cool story. So a lot of people ordered it. And when you see that big number, well, you think, hey, if they produce something good, there will be people that will buy it. And there's been other books that have had, like I think there was a few Todd McFarlane ones that were in that range. There are books that get those kind of numbers when the quality is there, or at least perceived quality. Um, so I just think that retooling of the books could result in that new inventory problem being kind of sorted out, that actually you can get those numbers where where you can get those massive sales. And once you get those massive sales, well then all these smaller sales, these books that have only had like 5,000 to 10,000 print runs, like really small print runs, well, those books are going to be just that much more sought after. You'll actually see modern books kind of outpacing what you might expect them to actually price out at. Like a good example of that is Invincible is a good example of that, where it's got kind of that crossover feel. The story is now being produced on Amazon. They're talking about making a video game. They're talking about multiple spin-off series. They're talking about multiple seasons of it. It's already gone 3 seasons. I think it's going to go for a 4th, 5th, and maybe up to 8th. They were talking about. So there's a lot of potential for that series to go fairly far, and it attracts a much younger demographic. It's ultra violent. It's very similar to anime, and as I said, it's a great crossover title. So what you find is, the popularity of that has driven the books that really had pretty low print runs. I mean, Invincible had print runs of anywhere from 10 to 20,000. It was not like massive books, but what happens is people kind of get into the hobby that way, and they want to collect it. So I don't know. I see this no new inventory is not really a strong argument, because, as I said, it's just a matter of looking at it on a case-to-case basis. If you produced crappy books, sure, there's no inventory. But I think there is inventory for things where people perceive the quality, and there is that demand there. It's just you have to give something that the people will actually enjoy and want to buy. It's just, and that's just that will change. I think that will happen. We see it in the Scholastic book thing, where there is the quality that or subject matter that they're interested in. Well, if they create it again, they can obviously succeed. Okay, another big thing that could happen, and this is one of the apocalyptic kind of ways of looking at the hobby, is what if Marvel and DC, the two biggest, really, they represent the pillars of the comic book market. What if they die? Like, DC and Marvel have in the past gone both kind of bankrupt at one point or another. They've been, circling the drain for a while. And it was really the MCU and the DCU that pulled them out and pulled them up, and where they actually succeeded. Well, what if, they've been making a string of bad movies lately that just haven't been performing well? I can't think of like the only ones that performed well were the Spider-Man movies. But those were not even Marvel movies. those were Sonyverse. So the question is, like, can these companies survive? You know, like, you know, there's so much money that you can put into movies and just lose every time. You know, if you spend 300 million on a movie and you're only making 100 million, well, you can only do that so many times before you're bankrupt. And what if both DC and Marvel collapse? They're gone, let's say. Well, is that likely to happen? First of all, I do believe that you know, companies. You know, I remember Apple, and I remember Apple was kind of circling the drain too at one point, where it was almost a penny stock. It almost was like worthless, and they had sort of gotten rid of Steve Jobs, and they were kind of not innovating. They weren't doing anything that was particularly good. They were just recycling the same old tired computers, and they had sort of lost that visionary that was driving the company forward. And because of that, they're going bankrupt. They were just killing the innovation within the company. Well, when they brought Steve Jobs back, all of a sudden that visionary is back, and he's like bringing in, injecting new ideas, and he has like a direction for the company that brings the brings that company back to some kind of new direction, new and better direction. And within now, it's one of the biggest companies in the world, worth I think $4 trillion or something crazy. You know, so that can happen where you see that with both Marvel and DC, where right now they're kind of lacking the visionaries, but DC, for example, has brought in James Gunn to be that visionary, and for the most part, James Gunn is an avid comic enjoyer. He understands, he appreciates the comics. He might like the more obscure characters, but he has successfully built franchises in the past. Guardians of the Galaxy is a good example of that, where he's built these characters that nobody knew into being, you know, loved by many. You know, I think that kind of change can definitely, you know, resuscitate these sort of dying companies. Will Marvel find a new visionary to do the same? I'm not sure. Hasn't been. I haven't seen it yet. I'm not a big Kevin Feige fan. I'm not. So sorry, Kevin Feige. I don't think you're the man. I think we need somebody else. But the point is, if they, you know, they can easily be brought back. You know, the material is there. It's just they have to utilize it, and, you know, get some more visionary kind of people involved. The Ultimates, both for Ultimate X-Men and Ultimate whatever, and the the new DC version of the same thing, have been successful. So you can see that, you know, there is a pushback. Like, I'm Not Dead Yet would apply for both of those companies, where they really are willing to continue their companies, and they are pushing the material. I think both DC and Marvel, they see the movies as something that is really important, and that is the ultimate where they'll make their money, and all the merchandising and all that kind of stuff. That's where they make their money. But they see the seed that lets that plant grow, that money tree grow, is really the comic books. That they, you know, whenever, like, you can almost predict what characters will be in the next movie based on what comics are coming out. You know, I knew that Doom was going to be used sometime soon because the comic books were kind of reflecting that, you know, Marvel's own interest in that character. You know, that they're not very subtle. You know, they really showcase who they think they're going to put their effort into in the comic book. So I do see them as seeing comic books as the seed from which all else grows. And that bodes well for the comic book marketplace, because, you know, if they're willing to, you know, put that effort into it, and they also seem to agree that is where it all starts from, then they're going to keep comics not just for 1 or 2 years, but for many, many years to come. So yeah, that's kind of my thought on that. I don't see them collapsing, and I see them as still really strengthening their comic book side. Now, another thing that I've heard a lot is there's too much supply. And this is another argument that's been made, that the whole market's going to crash because there's just too much supply. Look at the CGC census. There's like 1 million copies on the CGC. All the, that kind of doom and gloom about the supply. It's always a supply versus demand. Well, if there's too much supply, well, there's not enough demand to meet that supply. Well, the values will drop. And this is really more about the older comics, right? That, there's just too much supply, and therefore, there's just not enough people collecting to justify that supply, and the value is going to drop. That can happen. That does happen. But what I'm thinking is, when you actually look at the supply, you get different ages having different supply amounts. So probably the Bronze Age is probably the worst for this, where bronze and copper maybe, and 90s, that's the worst, Plastic Age, where there were a massive number of books being produced. And those books really haven't contributed much in terms of the value of the market in general, just because they haven't really performed that well. I mean, you get some outliers in the Bronze Age, obviously, where they didn't have that supply. But for the most part, the ones that have been mass-produced, like that have huge print runs, really haven't gone up huge amounts. Like, it's not like like X-Men 1 from the 90s is a $1 million book. It's like maybe $100 book in a 9.8. It's not, there's not that much value there, and there never was. So I don't think the too much supply thing really applies. The books that maybe have like higher supply would be ones like Hulk 181 is a good example of one that has a fair amount of supply. Like there's just a lot of them. There's a lot of them. There's like 10,000 of them on the census. Or Amazing Spider-Man 300, or actually there's probably 20,000 of the Hulk 181s. Amazing Spider-Man 300 has maybe 30,000 or 35,000 on the census. Those books have huge amount. But if you look at the number of people that want to buy those books, it's just easily way more than the number of books out there, because those characters like Deadpool and Wolverine and all those characters are basically loved by a new group, a fairly big group of people. Like there's enough demand there that Wolverine is the one I was trying to get at. That there's enough demand there that people will still, create enough demand that there's not enough supply to beat. One of the things that I was trying to calculate when I was actually doing this video, and I found a whole bunch of different numbers, and I was really trying to work out how, if this too much supply question really kind of, asks a sort of a secondary question. Well, we know kind of how many books there are, right? As I said, on the census, we know that there's probably about 20 to 30,000 of whatever book, right? Of some of these. And then you say, okay, well, probably there's maybe another 10,000 or 20,000 that are raw. Let's say there's 50,000 altogether. Okay, that's a pretty big number, right? 50,000 books. And I'm just saying, I'm not talking about any specific book, but generally for these Bronze Age all the way up to Copper Age, or even Silver Age, you can bring those all in. Silver Age is probably less than that, obviously, but let's say 50,000, just as a number. well, how many people, like that's the supply. Well, what's the demand? Okay. So we have to look at, well, how many people collect comics? And that's a question that I was trying to find an answer for. How many people collect comics? And I was trying to think about it this way. So whenever I ask any people that I know, and I mean people that I just know as just regular people, even clients, I mentioned I collect comics, and I get kind of feedback from them. Um, Usually, I find that pretty much everybody that I know, like that are not necessarily in this hobby, but they have comics in their life. They have either a box of comics at home. I've mentioned to a few clients, and they're like, "Oh, I have a few comics, and are they worth anything?" They always ask that question, um, and so there's those casual buyers. Okay, so how many casual comic collectors are there? So let's say the market, there's like probably about, in North America, there's probably about 170 million men. Okay, 170 million men. I'm sorry, women. I'm kind of excluding you for now, but there are women that buy comics. They're just a smaller demographic in terms of who's buying the comics. Okay, so let's say 170 million men that could potentially be comic collectors. Now, obviously, it's not that high, um, but I would say like 1 in 1,000 would be a realistic number for maybe maybe even less than that. Maybe it's or maybe it's more than that. I mean, 1 in 500. So let's say it's around 100,000 to 300,000 people are collectors. Okay, so that's a probably, let's take that 300,000 number, because I'm taking the high end, because I think that's probably pretty accurate. That's a pretty reasonable guess. I mean, that's a pretty small chunk out of this. That's like 1 in 1,000 people, or 1 in 500. That's not that many. Now, of that, how many would buy? So those are collectors. There's obviously a much bigger pool that would be casual, like I have a few comics at home kind of people. But these are collectors. So let's say 300,000 collectors. Now, of that 300,000, how many would be interested in any particular book? And that number gets really, really small, right? Because like I might be a Wolverine fan, but the next guy might not be. Like I might be a DC fan, next guy might be a Marvel fan. There's like different segments within the comic book community. But I would say the bigger characters pretty much are universally liked. Like they're universally liked. And so I'd say that probably, there's maybe 100,000 people that are interested in those books that there's 50,000 of. And so as long as there's enough people, there will be enough interest to keep the values up. That's why sometimes I'm a little bit nervous with certain books, because I don't really feel like there's too much supply. It can be a real problem, right? Where there's just too much supply and the books go down in value. We see that all the time with modern books when they come out, that some cool cover comes out, and it goes up at first because there's just not much supply. But once the supply hits the market, then the price comes down. It happens all the time. However, one thing that we do have going for us is time. We've seen these books on the market for like 30 years. It's not like they're brand new books. Like Hulk 181 is from the 70s. It's like 40 years ago. It's a well-established book. It's almost 50 years. Jeez, I'm getting old. So the point is, those books have been well established. The market size has been well understood, and we can say, well, no, there seems to be that balance. There's always that fine balance where crashes and bubbles and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it's kind of established a value, and it's got a nice trend line. We can see those trend lines, and we know that the supply and demand balance has been reached. Okay. And it's sort of on a upward trend overall. The trend is your friend in this case. So when I hear this too much supply thing, I actually think, well, actually, maybe not. I don't think there is too much supply. I think it's in that balance stage where there's enough demand that it can continually increase the price over time. That, some people get out of those books. Some people want to, but there's always seems to be somebody who wants to get into those books to balance it out. Now, if you look at Golden Age, it's even different. When you get to that really, really small demographic of people that are interested in Golden Age, and we're talking maybe a handful of collectors, like maybe 1,000 to 10,000 collectors that are really, really willing to spend big money on a book. Well, the supply is so small in the Golden Age. Like, we're talking less than 100 on copies of these books. Well, that's why those books command big money, because there's just not enough supply to meet even a few hundred people being interested in that. And I know it's bigger than that. I know there's at least, I can think just people I know that there's over 10,000 people that are interested in Golden Age. So I just from people I know, that's crazy that it's that many, but there's that many people that are interested in Golden Age, and those people are interested and willing to spend $1,000 to buy one book. So there's enough demand there, and I don't see that as changing. I see as people die out, I see new collectors coming in. There's always seems to be this new crop of people who are getting into it that are just, oh, this is so interesting, and they get into the hobby. So I don't think the too much supply thing is going to actually be true. I actually see that we're in actually the opposite situation where there's actually not enough supply. And I have to explain that because, certain books, obviously, as I said, back to X-Men #1 from the 90s, too much supply. But we don't worry about those books because, as I said, this supply demand thing, it's been kind of sorted out. We kind of know where the trend lines are. But what I do see is right now those trend lines are based on a weak market. It's been weak. Even during COVID, I would say it's been a weak market. Okay? You have an injection. You can actually see, like, the COVID thing was people that missed the hobby that came back. Okay? And you could see the impact that had on the prices. We were seeing prices doubling on a constant basis. And the reason for that was there was not enough supply for that demand. So my point is, right now we're in a kind of a depressed market where people have kind of moved away from the hobby, but those people could easily come back. There's no, there's no like hatred for these comics. They love the comics. It's just that they've been pushed out because of a bad experience with COVID pricing. Also with movies not being so great or whatever, that's pushed them out, but they could easily come back. It's just, a lot of this can be turned around, is my point. And even with it not being turned around, the market is still growing. So I think there's a potential there that, if there's any kind of resurgence into the hobby again, you'll see these prices being like just back to COVID numbers, like that. It can where you'll see those spikes again. And it's just that we have to get the market excited again, and it's weird that has to be the case. That you have to, I saw it during the 90s that it was boom bust, and part of it is like people are very transient about their about their hobbies. You get the core base, the diehards. I'm like a diehard, but a majority of people are kind of more, they love the hobby, but at the same time they see it as like a they're gonna trade and make money, lose money. That game of it where they can make it as an investment, and that's perfect. That's part of the hobby. That's part of the fun of it. But sometimes those people get burned and they leave, right? And the flippers, I should call them. But those people can easily come back, and they're actually an important part of the hobby. They kind of inject like this new excitement into the hobby, but they can easily come back. And I think things that will make them come back would be successful movies, good stories being returned into the books. Even the market itself, what I saw was people holding back certain books, and the excitement of when those books get put back onto the market, brings some of that energy back, and then you get some record sale, and just the excitement of a record brings people back. It's weird that way, that you have to have that. It's sort of like when part of the thing that like people don't realize that fueled the whole COVID boom was one book. One book fueled the COVID boom, and it was crazy. It was Amazing Fantasy 15 having that $3.6 million sale. That one sale made people excited about comics again. It was that sale that kind of got people going again into the hobby. They were like, oh, I heard about this crazy sale. Like, it was news. It was big news. And people are like, oh, I'm stuck at home. I have nothing better to do. I might as well look into this hobby again that I used to love as a kid. And, you get that kind of reigniting of that, collector spark that's in people. So I really do see that the too much supply thing is actually not an issue. It's actually the other way around. There's not enough supply for that potential demand. So, okay, so that's like, I really went into that one a bit long. The last of my Steelman arguments is that the collectors are dying. That's one of these arguments that I've heard, especially in the Golden Age. You get these Golden Age collectors that are dying. And I kind of addressed this part in one of my previous Q&A videos, where I talked about what happens when the boomers die. The boomers die, and they're pretty much, all their books get flooded onto the market, and all of a sudden they go to worthlessness because there's not enough people to balance out all these boomers that have died. And I actually think two things will happen out of that. Just like I was talking about with the AF-15 and the excitement that happened with that AF-15, one of the things that happens when you inherit a collection is, well, there's actually a few things that happen. One, you're like, okay, I got this thing. I know it's valuable. I don't know how valuable it is, but I got a thing, and I want to know how valuable it is, okay? So the first thing that everyone that inherits something, you can inherit like a chair or a lamp or whatever it is, but you go, how much is it worth? It's like the greed factor comes in. I don't know why, but I think it's true. People, when they inherit something, they think, how much is this worth? What can I get for it? And what ends up happening is you have either the people that just sell it and go, thank you, I get my money, and walk away. Or you get people who, when they get this collection, they go, well, I see some of these books are worth a lot. And they get interested in it. I really think of Pockets Full of Comics, where his grandfather gave him a collection of comics, Golden Age comics. He had no clue about. He didn't even know how to properly bag and board them. But he went from that level, where he didn't even know how to bag and board or anything about grading or anything, to now being a reasonably savvy collector, where he's buying collections, and I see a lot of people doing that, where when they get these things, they're just so keen, like they're like, oh, this is so cool, like it creates new collectors. Not all of them are going to be collectors, but I do see that there'll be that demand built from a new audience that's being created by people that inherit the collections. The other thing that I see is that a lot of these collections, like especially Golden Age books, like this is kind of my interesting is I have been seeing some of these books coming onto the market that you haven't, like, that literally have maybe 10 sales in the last 20 years. You know, you just never, they're ghosts. They just don't sell that often. And all of a sudden we're seeing them on the market. Now that could be these older collectors dying and, you know, they're coming onto the market. But what instantly happens is, because these books are so rare, especially Golden Age, like Golden Age is like more so than any other age, because the books are just so scarce, like under 100 census. Um, those books get absorbed really quickly because there's excitement about just seeing that book. You know, I've been waiting for this book for 5 years, and now it's finally on the market. I'm gonna grab it. You know, so, and generally you'll have record sales every time because there's just enough collectors there that are not boomers. These are people my generation, which would be Gen X, people that are in their 50s that have that extra disposable income or money that they can use, and are waiting for these books to just hit the market. They're just waiting. When am I going to get a chance to get this book? That's a really common thing I've heard. When am I ever going to see this book again? And I think that there will be sort of a boom of that, where we'll see a whole bunch of really unique books coming to the market that we haven't seen for a while, and it'll get absorbed very, very quickly. Like, these are books that just don't have the numbers. So I think that will kind of be what will happen when these Golden Age or these older collectors die. That you'll see that there'll be a new generation. Like, my generation is now, like, 20 years ago we weren't in the space where we could afford these books. Now my generation is the generation that can buy the books that we saw our grandparents or parents taunting us with. Oh, look at this cool book I have, and now we're the ones that can say, hey, I can get that book now. Okay, so I really do see that there is a kind of that passing of the torch, and I kind of talked about that in my my previous video on this. So those are my Steelmans. That there's no new collectors in the hobby, that there's no new inventory that could, that's another, apocalyptic thing that could happen. That the collapse of the big two, there's too much supply, and that the old collectors are all dying off. And there is some truth to all of those things, but I hope that my arguments have, taken down these Steelman arguments of why the market is dying. And I do not believe that we're at the end of the comic book collecting hobby. I think we got many more years to go. It's not Beanie Babies. It's not like Beanie Babies where they went to worthless. The problem with Beanie Babies compared to comics is Beanie Babies were kind of a flash in the pan, a fad. And fads happen, even with comics. Comics were a fad at one point. In the 90s, definitely a fad. But there's enough long-term development in the comic book space that it's much more strongly based than some of these other hobbies that kind of go up and then crash. Comics have done enough boom bust cycles that they are well established, and I think that longevity will continue on. We're talking about an industry it's not just today that it's been created. It's been around for 80 years, almost 90 years, that comic books have been something that people have collected. So I think it's going to last a few more years. We're not dead yet. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give me your feedback below. And what do you think? Are we at the end of comic book collecting, or is it just the beginning? So again, thanks for watching. Bye for now.